Paul McCartney on what it was like for him after the Beatles broke up and who it was.
You were talking about the business of the Beatles, and who knows who broke. Everyone has a theory.
I know.
Who broke it up?
John.
They were more than just bandmates. Paul McCartney and John Lennon were like brothers, laughing, creating, and changing music forever. But somewhere along the way, everything changed. Fame got bigger, so did the pressure. And the friendship that once felt unbreakable started to fall apart. The Beatles broke up. Fans blamed different people. And when John was taken from the world too soon, Paul was left with memories, regrets, and a silence he rarely broke. But now, at 82, he's finally opening up about John, about the pain, and the truth we never really knew. Join us as we revisit their bond, take a look at their fallout, and reveal Paul's powerful words that have been the talk of town recently. The Beatles. The Beatles were not just another band. They were a revolution. Formed in Liverpool in 1960, the group included 4 young men: John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. These 4 names would soon become known all around the world. The Beatles didn't sound like anyone else. At first, their music was rooted in skiffle, beat, and the rock and roll of the 1950s. But as time went on, they added more. They mixed in classical music. They tried pop in new ways. They even explored Indian music, folk, and hard rock. They didn't just play songs, they changed how people looked at music. They made it into an art form. They also became a big part of the 1960s counterculture. Young people everywhere looked up to them. Their music, their clothes, and even their words became a voice for a whole generation. You see, John and Paul were the main songwriters. Their partnership helped shape the band's sound and success. But even before they were the Beatles, even before the screaming fans and sold-out tours, John and Paul were just 2 boys with guitars. So how did this powerful story begin? Let's go back to where it all started, with a meeting that no one could have guessed would change music forever. When Paul met John. It was the summer of 1957 when John Lennon and Paul McCartney met for the first time. Paul was only 15, John was 16. At the time, John had a small band called the Quarrymen. They played at a village fair, and Paul happened to be there. After the show, Paul was introduced to John. They clicked almost right away. Paul had impressed John with his guitar skills and how he remembered all the words to popular songs. That was enough for John to invite him to join the band. Paul said yes. That day wasn't just the start of a band. It was the beginning of a deep friendship. As John later said, they would write eyeball to eyeball. That means they sat facing each other and shared ideas, words, and feelings. They worked as a team and they trusted each other. From the beginning, their friendship was something rare. It wasn't romantic, but it was deep. It felt like more than just friendship. It was full of trust, energy, and creativity. They didn't just play together. They understood each other. Some friends even said they could read each other's minds. They had very different personalities. John was sharp, bold, and often angry. Paul was calm, polite, and more careful with people. But they each thought the other was brilliant. And when they made music together, something magical happened. They would skip school or college to meet at each other's homes and write songs. These songs were about real feelings: love, jealousy, hope. Writing those songs made them open up to each other. It was like letting someone read your heart. There was also something else that brought them close: loss. Paul had lost his mother to cancer just months before he met John. And about a year after that, John's mother was hit by a car and killed. They didn't talk much about it, but they knew the other had been through the same pain. That silent understanding made their bond even stronger. They were just 2 boys trying to make music. But together, they were creating something the world hadn't seen before. From the Quarrymen to the Beatles. After Paul joined the Quarrymen, things started to change. John no longer stood alone at the front. They shared the stage, shared the spotlight, and most importantly, shared the songwriting. Soon they added George Harrison to the group. They played in clubs around Liverpool and later in Hamburg, Germany. Paul once described their bond by saying, "We complemented each other. It was a bit of yin and yang." He added, "I had some stuff he didn't have and he had some stuff I didn't have." That balance made their music strong. It made their friendship feel special too. In the early days of the Beatles, they even agreed to credit their songs as Lennon-McCartney, no matter who wrote most of the lyrics. Lennon explained, "It was never a legal deal between Paul and me, just an agreement to put both our names on our songs. That kind of trust doesn't come easy." But they had it. Over time, the group changed members. Stuart Sutcliffe, who had played bass, left. They tried different drummers. Eventually, in 1962, they invited Ringo Starr to join. That's when everything fell into place. The Beatles were born. Their manager, Brian Epstein, helped them become more professional. He shaped their image. Then came producer George Martin. He helped shape their sound. With these two and with the band's talent, they found success fast. Their first big hit was Love Me Do in 1962. From there, things exploded. Fans couldn't get enough. The Beatles were everywhere. This crazy love from fans became known as Beatlemania. They weren't just stars, they became symbols of a new generation. They influenced music, art, fashion, and even how people thought. Their albums grew more creative. They stopped doing live shows in 1966 and focused on recording. That led to classics like Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Later came the White Album and Abbey Road. Their music got deeper and more experimental. They explored new sounds, new ideas, and even spiritual journeys. They had gone from being four boys in a band to leading a cultural wave. But behind the scenes, things were starting to crack. And it wasn't just about the group, it was personal, especially for John and Paul. Why it all fell apart. As the 1960s went on, things inside the Beatles started changing. In 1968, they were working on the famous White Album. Both Lennon and McCartney were still full of creative energy, but their lives were going in different directions. John had fallen deeply in love with Yoko Ono. His world began to center around her. He also started using heroin, which affected how he worked and how he connected with others. At the same time, Paul had married Linda McCartney. Her father, Lee Eastman, became involved in Paul's business affairs, which complicated things even more. And so their personal choices started to affect their work. McCartney preferred a neat, organized style of recording. Lennon wanted more freedom to try new and experimental sounds. These creative differences led to arguments in the studio. Simple things like song arrangements or who should play what became big issues. Then came another big problem: business. After their manager Brian Epstein died, McCartney stepped up and took a lead role in decisions. But not everyone liked that. Lennon, in particular, felt that Paul was becoming too bossy. He didn't want to be told what to do, especially not by someone he once saw as an equal partner. John liked to be the leader. He wanted control of the room, the conversation, the direction. Paul didn't like being pushed around. He had his own ideas, his own pace, and he worked non-stop. John had also faced a lot of pain in his childhood. That pain never fully left him. As an adult, he began using drugs more and more. His mind was not as focused. He started pulling away. Paul, on the other hand, stayed productive. He wrote constantly. He pushed the band to keep going. But instead of pulling John back in, it made him feel distant. John felt like Paul was trying to take over. Paul felt like John didn't care anymore. Their chemistry, once so perfect, became tense. They argued more. The spark was harder to find. The group that once felt like a family was now struggling to stay together. All of this built up until finally, in 1969, Paul announced that he was leaving the band. In April 1970, the news became public. Fans were shocked. It looked like Paul was the one who ended it all, and the friendship between Lennon and McCartney seemed broken beyond repair. But that wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. What happened after the band broke up? After the Beatles broke up, John and Paul went through a difficult time. They weren't talking much, and when they did, it was often through lawyers or business partners. There was anger, there was sadness, and there was distance. In 1971, Lennon released a song called How Do You Sleep? It was harsh and clearly aimed at Paul. The lyrics were biting. Fans thought their friendship was over for good, but the truth was more complicated. The pain was real, but so was the love underneath it. Over the years, they slowly began to reconnect. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't like the old days, but it was something. They sent messages through songs. They began talking again, sometimes carefully, sometimes warmly. Paul once said that even when they were upset with each other, They never stopped being enthralled by each other. That says a lot. They may not have always liked what the other was doing, but they still cared deeply. That connection was never fully broken. By the mid-70s, the bitterness had mostly faded. They had grown up, they had families, and they had memories that only the two of them truly shared. They knew what they had meant to each other. And even though the friendship changed, the respect remained. You see, the bond between John Lennon and Paul McCartney was hard to explain. They weren't just friends. They weren't just bandmates or rivals. They were something else, something deeper. One writer put it best: "I don't think we have ever quite understood the depth, significance, or strangeness of this friendship. And maybe we never will, because their connection didn't fit into normal boxes like mates or enemies. It was more intense than that. It was full of love, anger, joy, and sadness, all at once. Friendships like this are rare. They sometimes happen in times of great creativity. And that's what the Beatles were, a burst of creativity that changed the world. Lennon and McCartney were right at the center of that storm. Their friendship created a space where new music could grow, where new ideas could live, and even when they drifted apart, that space never fully closed. Yes, they argued. Yes, they said hurtful things, but they also made history together. They shaped each other's lives, and they gave the world songs that will never be forgotten. But there is one question that is still asked today. Was there jealousy between John and Paul? John Lennon and Paul McCartney were one of the most iconic duos in music, but behind the success, things weren't always smooth. Over the years, fans and media started wondering, was John Lennon jealous of Paul McCartney? You see, John never openly said he was jealous, but if you look at what happened after the Beatles broke up, there were signs that jealousy may have been there. After Paul released his first solo album, John didn't hold back. He called the album rubbish. That one word showed that something was off. Paul didn't stay silent either. He wrote a song called Too Many People, where he hinted at his feelings toward John. John hit back harder with How Do You Sleep? That song was full of direct attacks on Paul. The lyrics included the line, "The only thing you done was yesterday." Paul took that personally. In response, he said, "I had to work very hard not to take it too seriously, but at the back of my mind I was thinking, wait a minute, all I ever did was yesterday? Let It Be? The Long and Winding Road? Eleanor Rigby? Lady Madonna? You, John." That wasn't the only clue. John also released a song called Jealous Guy. Paul believed that one was about him too. He said, he wrote, "I'm just a jealous guy." And he said that the song was about me. So I think it was just some kind of jealousy. Even in private, the tension continued. In one of John's letters to Paul from 1971, he said things like, "Get off your gold disc and fly." He even questioned Paul's beliefs about the Beatles' role in art and culture. The words were sharp and passionate. So was John Lennon jealous of Paul McCartney? Maybe not in a simple way. But the words, the songs, and the feelings all suggest that some part of John struggled with how things were changing, and Paul felt the sting. But this wasn't the end of their story, because slowly, things started to shift again. The first signs of healing. After the breakup and all the bitter words, no one expected Lennon and McCartney to ever reconnect. But in 1974, something surprising happened. Lennon was living in Los Angeles at the time. One day, he and his girlfriend May Pang decided to visit Paul at his home. They spent the evening together, laughing, talking, and even playing music. It was simple, but it meant a lot. That meeting was the first real sign that their friendship might not be over after all. And there was more. That same year, they almost did something wild. They nearly formed a supergroup. David Bowie remembered it clearly. He said, "It was New York, around 1974. And John was there, and he had Paul with him." Lennon told Bowie they wanted to form a trio with him. The group would have been called something like David Bowie and the Beatles, or DBB. They didn't follow through. But the fact that they talked about it shows how far they had come from the angry days right after the split. They were joking again, dreaming again, and for a moment, the old spark was back. At the same time, the legal fights between Paul, John, and the other bandmates were starting to calm down. It helped reduce the stress and allowed them to see each other more as people, not just partners in business or rivals in music. But the best part was that they also began to show public respect for each other's work again. Slowly, They were letting go of the anger, and they were remembering what had made them strong in the first place. The night they almost returned. In 1976, something happened on live television that gave fans a huge surprise. On Saturday Night Live, host Lorne Michaels looked into the camera and spoke directly to Lennon and McCartney. He joked that people said the two had problems with each other. Then he added, "If it's money you want, there's no problem here." Michaels held up a check and said, "A certified check for $3,000, offering that amount for them to come on the show and reunite." And guess what? John and Paul were actually watching the show together that night in New York. They looked at each other. They considered it. They even thought about going down to the studio. But in the end, they were too tired. They stayed in, enjoyed their night off, and laughed about it. That moment showed something important. Lennon and McCartney were no longer enemies. They could hang out, joke, and remember the old days. They were becoming friends again, little by little. Later that same year, Lennon invited Art Garfunkel and David Bowie to his place after the Grammy Awards. He brought up Paul and asked for advice. He wanted to know how to move past the pain. That shows just how much Paul still meant to him. Their bond was deep, and even when hurt got in the way, they kept trying to find their way back. Their final years together. In the last few years before John Lennon's death, the friendship between him and Paul McCartney became softer. The public didn't see much of it, but behind the scenes, they were growing close again. McCartney later said, "We had even more in common later." He remembered their time fondly. He was happy that they managed to reconnect. He said, "I was very glad of how we got along in those last few years. I had some really good times with him before he was murdered." Their final meeting was quiet and normal, nothing fancy. They just talked about simple things. Paul recalled, "Luckily, our last meeting was very friendly. We talked about how to bake bread." That one memory tells us everything. The tension was gone. The drama had passed. They were just two old friends talking about everyday life. After all the fame, the fights, and the songs, they had found peace. John Lennon and Paul McCartney didn't need to be a band again. They didn't need to write new music together. What they found in those last years was something even more important: forgiveness. And in that simple conversation about baking bread, we see the kind of bond that never really fades. "Think about me every now and then, old friend." By the late 1970s, John Lennon and Paul McCartney had begun to repair their friendship. After all the arguments and years of silence, they found a way back to each other. They had even talked about doing something together again. Lennon joked about their lifelong sibling rivalry in his final interview, showing that the bitterness had faded. But sadly, their time ran out. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot outside his New York apartment. He was returning home with his wife, Yoko Ono, when a man named Mark David Chapman pulled the trigger. It was shocking, sudden, and heartbreaking. Lennon was only 40 years old. That night, the world stood still. People cried in the streets. Fans held candles and gathered to sing his songs. Vigils happened all around the world. But there was no official funeral for John Lennon. Still, those who loved him found their own way to say goodbye. Among them was Paul McCartney. Though Paul didn't attend a funeral, he grieved in his own way. And in the years that followed, he often spoke kindly of John. He shared something that John's wife, Linda McCartney, once told him, John's last words to Paul. According to Linda, John had said, "Think about me every now and then, old friend." Those simple words stayed with Paul. They meant everything. They were full of peace, warmth, and love. Musician Carl Perkins was so moved by those words that he included them in a song called "My Old Friend." When McCartney first heard the song, he was so emotional, he had to leave the room. The loss hit him deeply, and those final words from John only made it more real. Years later, Paul opened up about how he felt after John's death. Speaking on BBC Radio 2 with Sean Lennon, John's son, he said, "I'm so happy I got it back together with your dad. It really would have been a heartache to me if we hadn't reunited." He went on to say, "It was so lovely too that we did, and it really gives me strength to know that. That bond, once broken, had healed, just in time. A bond that was never really lost." You see, John Lennon and Paul McCartney had a complex relationship. They started as best friends and creative partners. They made history together. But over time, fame, business, and personal struggles pulled them apart. Still, even during the worst times, they never stopped caring about each other. When Lennon died, McCartney wasn't the only one grieving. Fans, musicians, and former bandmates were all shattered by the news. Lennon's death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the end of any chance for the two friends to fully reconnect in person. And that's what made it even harder. But McCartney found peace in their last conversations. In one interview, he shared, "Luckily, our last meeting was very friendly. We talked about how to bake bread. It was nothing fancy, just two old friends sharing simple things. And that made it even more meaningful. There may not have been a public reunion, no big concert or dramatic apology, but the love between them never truly disappeared. Even after all the ups and downs, they found a quiet understanding." McCartney also stayed in touch with Lennon's son, Julian. In 2022, Julian posted a photo of himself with McCartney and called him Uncle Paul. That moment showed how strong the bond remained, not just between John and Paul, but between their families too. So while the world may have lost John Lennon too soon, the connection he shared with McCartney lived on, through music, through memory, and through the words, "Think about me every now and then, old friend." And just when fans thought they had seen it all, Paul McCartney gave them something truly unexpected, a moment that proved his love for the past still lives in the present. A surprise like no other. On the night of the 11th of February 2025, Sir Paul McCartney gave fans a surprise they'll never forget. At 82 years old, the Beatles legend played an unannounced concert at the Bowery Ballroom in New York City. The news came out just before noon, and within 30 minutes, every single ticket was gone. The venue only fits 575 people, so only a lucky few made it inside. One fan, Devon Ivy, ran out of her apartment just 15 minutes after the announcement and got in line. She later posted her $50 ticket and said, "Not a bad way to spend $50, huh?" She was one of the first. By 12:30 p.m., it was completely sold out. Fans who didn't get tickets still waited outside the venue, hoping for a glimpse, and they weren't disappointed. McCartney arrived in a black SUV wearing dark jeans, a navy jacket, and sunglasses. Some people saw him wave. One fan shouted, "Paul McCartney is back in New York City, baby." Another said, "Oh my God, I just saw Paul McCartney." Even if they couldn't go inside, just seeing him made their day. Once inside, McCartney walked onto the stage and said, "So here we are, some little gig, New York, why not?" And with that, he took fans on a journey through time. He started with A Hard Day's Night, one of the Beatles' early hits from 1964. The crowd was in awe. He kept the energy high with Got to Get You Into My Life, and then mixed things up with Wings songs like Letting Go and Let Me Roll With It. That last one hadn't been in his set since 2007, and he even added a little surprise. He blended it with a jam from Foxy Lady by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. But the most emotional moment came when McCartney picked up his guitar and played Blackbird. It was just him and the music. The room went quiet. Then came more Beatles favorites. Lady Madonna, Get Back, Obla Dee, Obla Da, Let It Be. And of course, Hey Jude. The fans sang along to every word. When McCartney heard a loud shriek from the crowd, he stopped and smiled. He said that was a Beatles scream. Then he laughed and added, "Okay, let's get it out of the way. Girls, give me a Beatles scream." The crowd screamed their hearts out. But the most touching moment was when he paid tribute to John Lennon. While performing Now and Then, a song John had started in the 1970s, Paul paused and said, "Let's hear it for John." The song was completed in 2023 using AI, but the heart of it was always Lennon. The crowd clapped, some teared up. It was clear how much Paul still cared about his old friend. An evening fans will never forget. After the main set, McCartney gave the crowd even more. He returned for a 3-song encore from Abbey Road, Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight, and The End. As the final note rang out, he smiled and said, "This has been a blast. We've lived it." That night was more than just a concert. It was a moment filled with music, memory, and emotion. Fans had rushed to the Bowery Ballroom hoping for something special, and Paul delivered. The concert reminded everyone why McCartney is a living legend. He brought Beatlemania back to life for one magical evening, and reminded us all of the deep love and bond he still holds for John Lennon. The cheers, the songs, the screams, and the silence all told one story. The story of a Beatle who still carries the music in his heart. What do you think about the complex bond John and Paul shared? Was it more love, more rivalry, or a bit of both? And how do you feel seeing Paul still honoring John after all these years? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more incredible stories from Hollywood's fascinating history. See you next time.